The wind does not forgive. It tears across the steppe with a fury that seems almost personal, driving needles of ice into every exposed surface of skin. Somewhere in what will one day be called Central Europe, 35,000 years before the present, a group of 19 humans presses deeper into the narrow cave that has become their world. They have been here for 23 days now. The dried meat ran out on the 15th day. The bone marrow they cracked from old kills sustained them for another 5. Now there is nothing left but the gnawing emptiness that has become their constant companion, and the wind that never stops screaming outside. The eldest hunter sits near the cave mouth, his eyes fixed on the white emptiness beyond. He is perhaps 40 years old, ancient by the standards of his people, and he has seen winters like this twice before. He knows what is coming. He has watched it happen, watched the slow dissolution of everything that holds people together when the food disappears and the body begins to consume itself. He does not speak of what he knows. There are no words in his language for the thing that approaches, only the memory of it written in the hollows of his face. Deeper in the cave, a mother holds her daughter against her chest. The child is perhaps 4 years old, and she has stopped asking for food. This is not a good sign. When children stop asking, it means their bodies have begun the terrible process of surrender, redirecting every remaining calorie toward the organs that matter most, abandoning the parts that do not. The mother knows this without understanding it. She feels it in the strange coolness of her daughter's skin, in the way the small body has grown lighter day by day, as if preparing to become something that the wind might carry away. This is the reality that shaped our ancestors for millions of years. Not the occasional inconvenience of a missed meal, but the recurring, predictable, and often fatal experience of true starvation. The archaeological record speaks of this reality in a language written in bone, in the chemical signatures of nutritional stress, in the silent testimony of graves that cluster together in the final layers of abandoned settlements. To understand who we are as a species, we must first understand what hunger did to those who came before us. The biology of starvation follows a predictable sequence, a cascade of failures that the body initiates in a desperate attempt to preserve its most essential functions. Within the first day without food, the body exhausts its readily available glucose and begins to draw upon glycogen stores in the liver. This reserve is limited, typically lasting no more than 24 hours of normal activity. Once it is gone, the body enters a state of ketosis, breaking down fat reserves into ketone bodies that can fuel the brain and other organs. For those with adequate fat stores, this phase can sustain life for weeks. The body becomes remarkably efficient, reducing its metabolic rate, suppressing unnecessary functions, conserving every possible calorie for the essential work of survival. But this efficiency comes at a cost. Cognitive function begins to decline. The starving individual becomes obsessively focused on food, unable to think of anything else. Social bonds weaken as the brain redirects its limited resources away from the complex calculations of empathy and cooperation toward the simpler imperative of finding something to eat. When the fat reserves are finally exhausted, the body crosses a threshold from which there is no easy return. It begins to consume its own muscle tissue, breaking down the proteins that form the structural foundation of every organ. The heart weakens, the lungs lose their capacity. The immune system collapses, leaving the starving individual vulnerable to infections that a healthy body would easily defeat. At this stage, even if food becomes available, recovery is uncertain. The damage may already be too severe. Archaeological evidence of starvation stress appears throughout the prehistoric record. Researchers have identified telltale signs in skeletal remains, lines of arrested growth in teeth and bones that indicate periods of severe nutritional deprivation, thinning of bone walls that suggests the body was mining its own skeleton for essential minerals, patterns of disease and infection that cluster around individuals who were clearly weakened by lack of food. These markers appear with troubling frequency in populations across every continent and every time period, suggesting that starvation was not an exceptional event, but a recurring feature of prehistoric existence. At certain sites, the evidence tells an even darker story. Researchers have uncovered human remains that bear the unmistakable signatures of post-mortem processing. Cut marks on long bones consistent with the removal of flesh, impact fractures where bones were broken to extract the rich marrow within, scraping patterns that indicate systematic butchery rather than random damage. These are the marks of survival cannibalism, the consumption of already dead individuals by those desperate enough to cross the most fundamental of human taboos. The prevalence of such evidence has forced researchers to reconsider their assumptions about prehistoric life. Survival cannibalism, it appears, was not the aberration of a few isolated groups in exceptional circumstances. It was a recurrent strategy, a last resort that many populations reached with troubling regularity. The sites that reveal this practice span hundreds of thousands of years and multiple species of early humans, suggesting that the consumption of the dead was a deeply rooted response to the equally deep-rooted threat of starvation. What distinguished survival cannibalism from other forms of the practice was its context of desperation and its apparent integration with continued social and ritual behavior. At many sites where evidence of consumption has been found, researchers have also found evidence of burial, of ochre pigment applied to bones, of careful arrangement of remains in designated areas. The dead were eaten, but they were also mourned. The taboo was broken, but some form of respect was maintained even in the breaking. The social dynamics of starvation are perhaps even more disturbing than the physical ones. Studies of famine in documented historical contexts have revealed a predictable pattern of social dissolution that likely applies, with variation, to prehistoric situations as well. In the early stages of food scarcity, social bonds actually strengthen. Individuals share what little they have, support the weak, maintain the rules and hierarchies that define the group. This is the period when cultural norms are most effective, when the social self holds firm against the pressure of the biological self. But as starvation continues, as days without food become weeks, as the body's nutritional reserves deplete and the brain begins to malfunction, this social cohesion erodes, sharing becomes more reluctant. Competition for resources becomes more overt. The weak, those who cannot contribute to the group's survival, begin to be marginalized. Children may be abandoned. The elderly may be encouraged to leave. The bonds of family and kinship that normally override individual self-interest begin to fray. In the final stages, social order may collapse entirely. Archaeological evidence suggests that some instances of cannibalism were not survival cannibalism in the strict sense, but homicidal cannibalism, the killing of individuals specifically for consumption. Skeletal remains with signs of violence preceding death, with defensive wounds on arms and hands, with skull fractures inconsistent with post-mortem processing, tell stories of final breakdowns that ended in murder. These were likely not planned actions, but desperate ones, the result of minds so damaged by starvation that they had lost the capacity for moral reasoning. The same neurological changes that cause obsessive thoughts about food, that impair judgment and emotional regulation, would also lower the threshold for violence. In a brain starved of glucose, the complex calculations of social consequence become impossible. Only the immediate imperative remains. The seasonal rhythm of prehistoric life was fundamentally shaped by the threat of winter famine. Archaeological evidence reveals that many populations developed elaborate strategies to survive the lean months, strategies that required foresight, cooperation, and the ability to delay immediate gratification in favor of future security. Food was preserved through smoking, drying, and storage in natural cold chambers. Populations gathered in larger groups at defensible sites with reliable water and shelter. Hunting efforts intensified in the autumn when animals were fattest and most numerous. These preparations were not always sufficient. The archaeological record contains numerous examples of winter occupation sites that end abruptly. Their final layers containing little evidence of food remains but abundant evidence of human suffering. At some sites, researchers have found the remains of entire groups, all ages and both sexes, suggesting catastrophic mortality events that left no survivors. These are the sites where the food ran out and help never came. The psychological legacy of this recurring threat is written in our minds as surely as it is written in our genes. Modern humans carry forward adaptations that evolved under the pressure of uncertain food supply, tendencies toward food hoarding, anxiety about scarcity, the intense pleasure we take in eating when hungry. These responses were essential for survival in a world where the next meal was never guaranteed. They persist today, often in forms that have become maladaptive in our environment of unprecedented abundance. Researchers believe that the recurring experience of famine may have shaped human social evolution in profound ways. The need to cooperate during lean times, to share food according to established rules, to maintain group cohesion even under extreme stress, would have favored individuals and groups capable of complex social organization. The very capacity for culture, for creating and following rules that override individual impulse, may have been honed under the pressure of survival. Those who could subordinate their immediate desires to the needs of the group were more likely to survive famines than those who could not. At the same time, the recurring experience of social breakdown during extreme famine would have created selection pressure for the ability to recognize when cooperation was no longer adaptive. Individuals who remained loyal to failing groups, who continued to share when sharing meant death, would have been less likely to survive than those who could recognize the signs of collapse and act accordingly. The result may be the complex and often contradictory moral psychology that characterizes modern humans. Our capacity for profound altruism alongside our capacity for equally profound selfishness. The relationship between hunger and violence extends beyond the immediate crisis of starvation. Archaeological evidence suggests that periods of environmental stress, when food resources declined across wide regions, were associated with increased rates of violent conflict between groups. Sites dating to periods of known climate deterioration often contain higher proportions of skeletal remains with evidence of violent trauma. Settlement patterns change, with populations retreating to more defensible locations. Weapons technology sometimes advances during these periods, suggesting an intensification of inter-group competition. This pattern makes intuitive sense. When resources are abundant, the costs of conflict typically outweigh the benefits. When resources become scarce, the calculation changes. The territory that once supported multiple groups can now support only one. The hunting grounds that were shared must now be defended. The bands that once traded and intermarried become competitors, then enemies. The archaeological record suggests that our ancestors understood this dynamic and prepared for it, building their settlements in locations that combined access to resources with defensive advantage. The evidence from prehistoric sites ultimately tells a story not merely of suffering, but of adaptation. The same species that experienced the horrors of famine and the breakdown of social order also developed the strategies and technologies that made such experiences less frequent over time. The development of food preservation techniques, the expansion of the dietary range to include previously unexploited resources, the creation of trade networks that allowed populations to buffer local shortages with resources from distant areas. These were all responses to the fundamental problem of uncertain food supply. The people in the cave will not all survive the coming weeks. Some will die of starvation, their bodies finally surrendering to the long process of depletion. Others may fall to the diseases that prey on weakened immune systems, and some, perhaps, will face choices that they never imagined making. Choices that will haunt whatever remains of their lives. But some will survive. They will emerge from the cave when the snows finally melt, gaunt and changed, carrying within them memories that they will never speak of but never forget. Their descendants will spread across the world, carrying with them the adaptations, both genetic and cultural, that their ancestors purchased at such terrible cost. The capacity to endure hunger, to cooperate under pressure, to break taboos when survival demands it, and rebuild social order when the crisis passes. These are the legacies of prehistoric famine, written into our biology and our psychology, shaping who we are in ways we are only beginning to understand. When we look back at the evidence of our ancestors' darkest hours, we are not looking at a foreign species. We are looking at ourselves, at the foundations upon which our humanity was built. The hunger that drove them to desperate acts is the same hunger that drives us, muted by abundance, but never entirely silenced. The choices they faced are choices we carry within us, latent potentials that we have the fortune never to test. They survived so that we might exist. Their suffering is our inheritance. And in understanding what they endured, we understand something essential about what it means to be human.